Today, I want to talk about what I call the economics of health in buildings. When Jorge invited me, I said, well, but can you allow me to talk more about a theme than about just a specific paper? And he said yes. So I want to indulge you in a lot of stylized facts and then briefly into 3 papers. And I really think that LA is like the perfect place to talk about this. So this is not about the coronavirus, but it is about how outdoor and indoor pollution ultimately affect our health. Which in LA is very apt because you look at LA and maybe actually that's the view from here. Yeah, I knew that of course when I used that picture. So LA is a great city and I really enjoy coming here. Actually 10 years ago, Richard, I gave a paper here on the economics in green building. That's already 10 years ago. So it's good to. I've been back I think in the meantime. But it's good to be here. But at the same time, even though it's so great, something is in the air. And what I mean with something is in the air, when you think about smog levels, so that's fine particles, NOx, etc. For those that are local, it's probably not a surprise, but LA consistently ranks number 1 when it comes to the smoggiest cities in the US. The smuggiest area in the US, that's kind of more the San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose area from a smog perspective is only number 8. And I live currently in Connecticut, so it's number 10. So, and this is important, about 18 million people live in the greater LA area and they're exposed day in, day out to fairly high levels of air pollution. I just opened the Apple app that now gives you some indication of the air quality index. And today is not a great day for people with a sensitive condition. So if you have a sensitive condition, not only corona, but also longer term, the fine particles. Time even put you on their cover, and that means a lot, but I will say it.
But what year is that? That's like 1984, right?
Well, this is a pretty long time ago, but that doesn't matter. Come on, for the story, that doesn't matter. To make you feel better, to make the LAers feel better, London, this is a very kind of concurrent topic where, basically people are, or kids are being kept home from school, Europe, and then I even have, this is Dutch. So even in Holland, in Little Holland, or especially maybe in Little Holland, air pollution is a big problem, and then China and India. So why is this important? Air pollution is killing us. Actually, yesterday, in the journal that we all read, Cardiovascular Research, I know that's number 1 on your reading list, next to the Journal of Political Economy, published a paper yesterday that 8.8 million premature deaths globally because of air pollution. Here's a World Health Organization report about 7 million premature deaths. So that's more than what's being caused by kind of active inhalation, which is smoking. Some not so pretty effects. So this is more kind of look at yourself if you live here. You have asthma attacks, it's pretty significant things like heart attacks, change in blood pressure, irritation in the ear, mild headaches, etc. Those are all. Do you feel that? After a day of teaching. These are real issues, and what's important, this doesn't just affect our health, but also ultimately our welfare. So there's a couple of really cool papers that look at outdoor pollution and the implications for your functioning on physical tasks. So a paper looking at Central Valley, pieces that are collected by people that pick berries, etc., and how that's affected by ozone concentrations, by Graf Sivitanidou. A really interesting paper that's relevant for the local LAFC, that soccer players, and this is on Germany, where matches basically basically they're assigned to stadiums, and then you have out games, so these players are randomly assigned to air quality conditions. So a lower number of passes for soccer players that are more exposed to air pollution, and then a paper on factory workers in China. And all of those papers show outdoor pollution matters for actually the physical tasks that you execute on. Now the good news here is that we spend 90% of our time indoors. We typically at home or at work don't have the door open. That's great. So you're almost like outdoors. But we're protected from outdoor environmental hazards by having a shell that's a building. And that's good. And we know that, we realize that on days that are smoggy, What's interesting, there's a couple of papers on China now, actually by Bill's colleagues at MIT, that show that on highly polluted days, people spent more time indoors. An earlier paper was done by Joshua Graf-Savin using the American survey on recreational time use, showing that people spend more time indoors on days where there's more pollution. And as we know, house prices capitalize the extent to which you're exposed to outdoor pollution, and especially like this JPE paper from Chai and Greenstone. AC is also a great example as an example of how buildings can protect us from outdoor hazards. So if you haven't read this paper, this is really awesome. It's Barreca et al. In the Journal of Political Economy. So they look at mortality rates that are basically due to hot weather. And hot weather they define as everything above 90 Fahrenheit. And I understand that LA, I think, on average has about 100 days above 90 Fahrenheit. So, it's 90 Fahrenheit is not very high if you live here. Let's say over the last century, the mortality rate from this high temperature, it's not even extremely hot, but high temperature, decreased by 75%. And here, I only show like very simple facts. In their paper, they show in a very elegant way that almost all of this reduction in mortality from heat waves, 75% reduction, is due to the adoption of AC by households across the US. So it's not access to healthcare, it's not electrification. I mean, it's a beautiful paper. So this really plays down what they do. But the significant increase in adoption of HVAC is basically the factor that's responsible for the decrease in mortality from heat exposure. So buildings can really help in protecting us from outdoor hazards. But the question is, are they really? And Rogier already pointed to us. This is kind of interesting. There's some evidence from the 70s after the oil shock, interesting measures being taken. So temperature is switched down to 16 Celsius. That's about, let's say, 60 Fahrenheit in buildings. Power cuts, so people were lighting candles. And importantly, building standards were tightened up. So we really started to seal the envelope of buildings. It was great for energy efficiency, but ultimately what it led to was something called sick building syndrome. So we're breathing the same air over and over again, and that led to very negative outcomes. There's a couple of papers on that. This is not just an issue from the 70s. If you look at the current building stock homes in Europe, and you look at the percentage of individuals that are living in a home that's deficient, there could be mold, there could be some leaking, etc. This is Europe as we knew it. Of course, this is now no longer part of it. Of course, this is not part of it either. It won't be part of it, I think. And the darker the color, the higher the percentage of households that are living in a home that's relatively deficient. And this is important because this is what we explored in our first paper. So 10 to 15%, for example, in Germany, in France, in Holland. Belgium has a much higher percentage, between 15 and 20%. Portugal, might not be exactly the same as Germany, more developing still in Europe. 25 to 30% of the population exposed to pretty bad housing conditions. And I think if you would do this for the United States, you would find something quite similar. So it's not that deficient housing conditions is just something of developing countries where there's like wooden huts and we still have to make cement floors, but it's also an issue that we face in the developed world. This is not just housing, but it's also in basically the places where we spend our time. And again, there's not many times when I'm in a conference room and doors are opened, even though I indicated that outdoor air quality might not be so great, but we looked just at CO2 levels, which is really a function of the air that we breathe out relative to the air that's being flushed by the HVAC system. So we looked at Google offices and those from the GSA, the General Services Administration, so government offices. And we put CO2 sensors there, and we looked at peak CO2 levels in these rooms. So we look at classrooms, we look at meeting rooms, and then some open office. And with the exception maybe of the open office in Silicon Valley, that's kind of normal use. That's like 9 a.m. in Silicon Valley when nobody's there yet. At that point, CO2 levels are below 1,000. But after that, basically all of the rooms, and you really have to look at this from a room level, not a building level, have CO2 levels above 1,000. Why do we use 1,000? Well, the EPA says that above 1,000 ppm CO2, there's going to be cognitive effects, so effects on your performance. And I'll show you a couple of studies on that later. Also talk a little bit about classrooms later. these were some of the classrooms that we observed, that we censored. They were at levels of 4,000 ppm. So when we just look at the modern world, the places where we live, the places where we work, we're significantly exposed to deficient homes and to actually office space that has very high levels or elevated levels of CO2. I talked a bit about external or outdoor pollution and physical performance, so physical tasks, soccer players, etc. We obviously care more about cognitive tasks. So a couple of recent papers on call center workers, very cool, again China, C-Trip call center in Shanghai and Nantong, where they use the external variation in outdoor pollution to look at the implications for the productivity of workers, which is obviously very carefully monitored. How often do you go to the toilet and stuff like that? A paper on Germany. Germany is actually pretty polluted as well from the Ruhrgebiet, where a lot of the manufacturing takes place, plus all of the diesel cars that drive at these unlimited speeds. The probability of logging in and trading of individual investors, which I find a kind of a nice proxy for cognitive performance. And then Matt Kahn, your own Matt Kahn, no longer, but still, in your minds, where he looks at judges in China and how long they take to resolve a case relative to outdoor pollution. And basically all of this points at more outdoor pollution, taking that variation as exogenous affects cognitive performance. So when we say, well, that's all great, but all of these metrics assume that what's outdoor is also basically indoor. And none of these studies really put a sensor inside and say, hey, what happens indoor? And here, we would find something that's very similar between indoor and outdoor, but in most places, especially in the summer when you put the HVAC on, or the winter in New York, indoor is a different environment than outdoor. So how does indoor environmental quality affect mostly cognitive performance? And we look at that for kind of in hipster language, in live, work, and not in play, but in learning. And I think the learning setting is especially important because that's basically human capital formation. So that's especially a time when you want to make sure that you got your air quality under control. So that's my very long introduction to first paper. So in the first paper, we look at live. So what we have is we have the German socioeconomic panel. It's a great data set. It's about 30 years of data. We use 1992 to 2014, but it goes back a little further. And as this paper sits longer with the journal, of course, our data gets older and older. It tracks people over time. People are on average in the survey for about 7 years. So you got 58,000 individuals and 360,000 observations. And it's all survey-based, right? So, so how do you feel? What's your income? What's the state of your home? Tell us about the maintenance. Is it good? Is it okay? Is it bad? The good thing about this survey is that there's actually an interviewer going door to door. So that gives us some confidence that when people say, my home really needs maintenance, that it also really needs maintenance. And when somebody says, my home is great, that the home is in reasonably good condition. So we exploit the variation in the condition of the home as a proxy for, how nice is it inside. So we don't censor these homes yet. And then we look at metrics that relate to demand for healthcare. So doctor visits, do you go to the doctor, the external margin, and how often do you go? I can tell you Germans go to the doctor quite a bit, but also how you feel, both mentally and physically. So self-reported scales, this data has been used a gazillion times by many studies, well published, so that gives us confidence that the survey data is pretty reliable. So when we look at the sample and we look at the variation, and I already showed you that graph of Europe, it won't be a surprise that about 50% of the sample, of the homes in the sample, at some point during the sample period are in need of some form of renovation, minor renovation, or major renovation. That's a much smaller part. And on average, 14% of the years in our sample, a home is in need of renovation. So it's not a small effect, right? It's not that very few of these homes are it's not necessarily bad condition, but in need of some maintenance. And we say, well, what's the effect of that on your health? And we'll talk about our identification strategy because endogeneity obviously is a very important issue here to kind of bring that home. I hope you can see it from the back. Here we look at, from left to right, these are homes that are in good condition, that need some renovation and that need a lot of renovation. Here we look at income. So let's say a quartile is the poorest quartile and the richest quartile. So basically, as you get richer, the number of times that you go to the doctor basically goes down. Well, that's not surprisingly, but basically, with the exception of the richest quartile, when the home gets worse, you go to the doctor more often. So just some stylized effects, non-parametric. We're going to control for this in our analysis. And the same holds for sick leave. So basically, what's interesting here, as you get richer, that affects your sick leave, but in fact, people are on sick leave more often, interestingly. So poor people probably are forced to go to work to just maintain their income. But when you go from good housing quality to bad housing quality, you see that change basically across the quartiles of income. Another more stylized fact, so these are the residuals of a very simple regression of health on observables, so age and income, gender, etc., etc. So here's age, and then on the y-axis we have self-reported mental health and physical health. I think this is always interesting generally to look at. So not surprisingly, this is your physical health. You can determine where you are on this scale. I'm kind of nearing the 40 point. I already start to feel a little weaker, but it's only going to go downhill from here. What's important here is the delta between, in the solid line, homes that are in good condition versus homes that are in not so good condition, and there's a consistent gap between the two. And again, we'll do this in a more proper econometric way in a second, but I like this graph a lot. Also like your mental health. That only gets better as you age, and at some point that decreases a little bit. So that's the good news. And again, there's this consistent gap for those living in well-maintained relative to non-well-maintained homes. So from an identification perspective, well, don't have to tell you who lives in deficient housing. Well, probably it's those that are that have a lower income. There's again a sorting effect, etc. And then we actually look at renovations. So we also know whether homes are renovated. Well, renovations are not exogenous, but there's one advantage here in Germany. So we just talked about the home ownership rate. In Germany, that's consistently at 50%. As a nation, Germany does pretty well. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing, but 50% owner, 50% renter. And that rental stock, to a very large extent, has been in the hands of institutional owners for a very long time. So unlike, let's say in the US or in Holland, where institutional buyers have stocked up on single-family residential much more recently, that has been the case in Germany for a long time. There's no stigma related to renting. I have friends that live in Germany that have a very high income that have been renting because they're just unsure whether they're going to stay. For a long time, also the German housing market, from a pricing perspective, was pretty flat in real terms. So that's actually very nice because we have these tenants, and for tenants, the renovation, obviously, to the extent that they could influence the landlord, would be endogenous, but we argue that an institutional landlord basically is going to decide on a renovation independent from the health of the occupant. So we say that renovation for tenants is pretty much exogenous. So in our identification, I think the most important part, beyond controlling for characteristics of the occupant in the dwelling, we use fixed effects for the occupant. So basically, we look at the changes in health relative to the changes in the condition of the home, and then we have unique dwelling individual identifiers. So we hope that kind of takes out some of the concern about endogeneity of the health indicator, and then all the standard stuff with time trends and standard error clustering. So here are some of the results. So first we look at these reported health indicators. Bad health, basically, so they ask people to rate on a 1 to 5 scale whether they're good or bad health. Here's your physical health, so that's 1 to 100 range, and then there's mental health. 3 columns for each. In the first, we don't have individual and dwelling fixed effects. In the second, we include that, and in the third, we only look at tenants. So that set of the sample that we think is where we can identify the effect in a more exogenous way. So a bad health, if you just look at our I think most strict regression, there seems to be a significant effect of the bad health indicator or of housing conditions on the extent to which you report on bad health. And that holds for both physical health as well as mental health, and the effect is stronger for homes that are in a more deficient condition. Okay, the second one is visits to the doctor. So we have 2 things. we have the extensive margin, so whether you go to the doctor in the first place, and then the second is how often do you go to the doctor. And like I said, Germans, I think on average go to the doctor 3 times per quarter, 12 times a year. So it's pretty.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
What are doctor bills in Germany?
Well, but don't forget that the GP system is much more prevalent in Germany and in Holland than it is here, right? So you go to your GP and you say, I have a headache, and the GP says, oh, that's too bad, just go home and come back in 5. This is how it goes in Holland. Come back in 5 days if you still have it, and then you come back in 5.
6 years to get a heart stent, but you can go to your PC
12 times a year. No, that's absolutely true. Yeah, there's no annual physical, so people will go much more often. So first, at the extensive margin, we look at the effect of home maintenance, major renovation, partial renovation on visits to the doctor in the first place, and we don't find a strong effect, or we don't find any effect. But then we look at, so that's the extensive margin. At the intensive margin, we look at the number of times that people go to the doctor. And there we find a pretty strong effect. So when your home starts to fall apart. So how do we know that? Well, it's in good condition, it needs partial renovation, needs major renovation. That doesn't lead immediately to more or to initial visits to the doctor, but for those that already go, it leads to a higher number. And so we have a long set of heterogeneity analysis, and what that shows is, like with corona, the more vulnerable are most affected by home condition. So female and the elderly are most affected by this, and those are the people that go to the doctor, especially the elderly, in the first place more often. And then we look at sick leave, and for sick leave, we don't find very significant results. We also argue that if you work, if you're elderly, you're more at home. If you work, you don't spend as much time in your home. Okay, then we say, well, is there avoidance behavior? So do people basically try to avoid these conditions like you see with outdoor pollution? Do they go indoor? And what we can look at is, do people move? So we look at the moving decision relative to housing condition. And what we see, both for tenants and homeowners, is that the propensity to move as induced by home condition is there. It's significant, and it's similar for tenants and homeowners. So they both vote with their feet. But then when you look at renovations, and we exploit this then in an event study, tenants, whether it's self-paid or paid by the landlord, have a much lower propensity to receive a renovation as compared to homeowners, which makes a lot of sense. If I'm a tenant, I'm not going to invest in my own home. That's up to my landlord. And my landlord doesn't have the incentive to invest in the home because in Germany there's fairly strict rent regulations. He's not able to raise the rent on me, probably to the level that he could earn back the investment, whereas I'm a homeowner. This basically accrues to myself. So we really see that incentives play a big role in first of all, or in renovations. Now, what's the effect of a renovation? I think this is kind of the cleanest way to think about our identification. So we say, well, if a home is renovated and that renovation is exogenous, which we think in the case of tenant-occupied homes it is, because many of these landlords are institutional landlords, and they don't look at the health of the occupant and then renovate the home. Do we see an effect of a renovation on different types of health status? And this is visits to the doctor, a full renovation. I think this is windows and this is HVAC after the renovation. There's an event study, so we care about what happens before. There's some effects, but they're insignificant, so we ignore them. That holds for the renovation of the full home, as well as the other types of renovations. And then subsequent, borderline, but we find that visits to the doctor go down in homes that have been renovated, whether it's full renovation, not so much for windows, but certainly for HVAC. So we think this is kind of the cleanest way that we can identify the impact of a home renovation on health outcomes. I mean, if your window is broken, the landlord will come and replace. But maintenance, let's say, replace a roof, put insulation in, replace the windows. That's much more programmatic, right? So these landlords will go in and say, okay, now we do this street, and then we do that street. We don't have information on that. There's another paper that looks at more these programmatic renovations. But because the institutional ownership is very programmatic in terms of the real renovations. I mean, things will be fixed if it's broken, right? If your heating system is broken, we'll come to fix it. So this is about work. And work, obviously, in our service society, indoor environments are important. And there's this big question about the cognitive effects of a building, or the effects that a building have on your cognitive performance. It's hard to run an RCT, which you would ideally do here. So we kind of have a quasi experiment that we use. So it's quasi, because this is 1,600 people in a municipal building in the Netherlands. You know, in the Netherlands, we have some of these historical buildings. This is one of these historical buildings. It used to be probably occupied by the Spanish army, but now it's the headquarters for a municipality in Venlo. Actually it's close to where Rogier is from. Then the municipality, they kept on adding people. That's what the Dutch bureaucracy does. So they built a new building, and the building, they pride itself really on its green characteristics. So there's a green facade. Actually, what's very interesting, the air inlet it's all mechanical ventilation, so it comes in kind of a green area, the air, and goes down into the building automatically or mechanically, and then is recycled back up. So the air supposedly is very clean. And they moved teams randomly from this, I don't want to call it the old building, but the existing building to the new building. Now, there's many things about the new building and the old building that are different, but we argue that we can exploit the differences in air quality, noise, light, and other IEQ, indoor environmental quality indicators. It's about 40 years old, no ventilation system. That may sound strange here, but in Holland, most buildings actually don't have HVAC. They have some form of mechanical ventilation. This building actually doesn't. It doesn't get very hot typically. So what we do is we start to survey the people that moved and the people that didn't move. And we did that in July 16, and then we did 3 survey waves after. So we can actually look using fixed effects whether the people that moved see significant improvements in their perception of air quality and sick building syndrome and sick leave. I mean, we're adding surveys all the time because we really also are interested in, are these effects persistent? Or do you basically see reversion to the mean where you have this initial excitement about being in the building and it's awesome, and then a year later it's like, well, yeah, actually the work at the municipality is still boring, so my building actually it's not so great. And there's a couple of studies actually on that people really revert back to their previous condition. So again, it's mostly survey based. We are getting access to administrative data as well because we have a unique identifier for each municipal worker. So we asked them questions, and this is a Berkeley survey on indoor environment about perception of temperature on 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions of noise, 3 dimensions of light, and 2 dimensions of air quality. And high is bad and low is good. It's all counterintuitive. But when we start to compare, and these are just some non-parametric comparisons, the stayed in old building and moved to new building, what we see, and this is using 3 survey waves, is that those that move to the new building feel significantly better about the temperature, about the air quality, about light, but not so much about noise. And that's not surprising because they move these people into like these nice open floor plans, which we think that it's very efficient, but people don't really like that because of noise issues. And then differences in the old building, you see slight differences with the 3rd wave, but they're insignificant. And we do some more formal analysis after that. So then we say, well, what's the impact on worker health? So as a municipality, as an employer, as a financial services firm, I care about, for example, the effect on sick building syndromes. Sick building syndromes, it's a bit related to what I described with the effect of outdoor pollution. It's dry eyes, it's a dry mouth, it's light headaches when you leave the building. Really, when you lock this door and you put all your students in a room and stay there for 2 hours, it's kind of the experience that you typically have unless the building is well ventilated. So here's the building that they moved to. This is the existing building, and you see pretty significant effects in the number of people that report sick building syndromes. We run a fairly simple difference in difference estimation where we can control for the characteristics of the people that moved, and we find that the difference is significant and at about 16%. So pretty significant implications on sick building syndromes as a proxy for how well do people feel in the building after they move. And in the 4th survey, these results are still consistent. And we say, okay, What determines that change in sick building syndrome? So we look at temperature, noise, light, and air quality. So here you got your coefficient with the standard error. So noise is kind of borderline significant, but it's really light and especially air quality that explains the improvement in sick building syndrome for those people that moved. So Moussa looks at me. You believe me or not?
I believe you.
Okay, good. It's like
I'm not being skeptical at all.
so air quality, but also light, which if you look at the two buildings, not too surprisingly, really seem to matter for that drop in sick building syndromes that people report. Okay. And there's more here, but I want to show you a third paper. Okay, so then the last one, and this is really the kind of, I go from most formal to least developed. This is a kind of a more long-running study that we've been setting up in Maastricht, really for the last 3 years. And it's been taking so long because of a sensor supplier out of Silicon Valley, which said they had a sensor, and of course they didn't. But the moment that we said we buy it, they started to produce it. So it took about 3 years to get it. But so this is about actually the impact of indoor environmental quality on the performance of, in this case, elementary school students, which I know a lot of us care about. Even if your kids are already older, you should still care about it because we got about 2 billion kids globally. Schools are a great place to measure the effect of indoor air quality, but it's also a place where you're really exposed to the same type of environment about 8 hours a day. So elementary school, kids don't really roam around like your students do. They're like stuck in the same room, kindergarten, first, second grade, stuck in the same room. Sure, they can go out for recess 15 minutes here and 15 minutes or 20 minutes for lunch, but the rest are in that same room. There's about 130,000 school buildings in the US, and a large fraction of those have really seen underinvestment, not surprisingly. So about a quarter has been rated as D plus by our own local governments. Now, probably don't have to convince you that your primary school years are pretty fundamental in your cognitive development. So in case indoor air quality has an effect on your cognitive development, this has significant policy implications. So why do we like schools? Kids, at least in the Netherlands, take standardized tests from kindergarten, so the age of, in the Netherlands, 4, 2 times a year. And so from 4 to 12, they're at their elementary school, 2 times a year, they take standardized tests. That's mandated by the government. The results we can actually use. So at the level of the individual student or pupil, we have these test outcomes. Individuals are randomly assigned to classrooms in school. So I'm now in 2nd grade, cool, you go to this classroom, now in 3rd grade, go to the next classroom. So we can track the students in different rooms over time. And again, like I said, students are in these rooms for about 8 years. These are the tests that we have access to. So there's some Dutch words here, but it's basically the teaching monitor in Limburg, which is the province where Maastricht is. And again, we have these annual national standardized tests, and then one more time a year there's other standardized tests. And then we also have information on the socioeconomic profile of every kid. We have absence data, we know BMI, we know all of their health. So it's a very rich data set. Here are those sensors that took a little long to arrive. So we bought 300 sensors from a sensing company in the Bay Area called Acclama. It's great. It collects data on temperature, humidity, on fine particles, on CO2, also on noise, which we use as a proxy for concentration in the classroom. Sends that data to the cloud, and we can just pull it out and analyze it. So this gets to kind of big data. I don't want to promote these guys because it's horrible to work with them, but we have our sensors and it works. So and it's very early days. We're getting the first test results now, so we're excited to start working on this data. But I just want to show you. So we got these. So in 30 schools, 280 classrooms. Again, we got a new school, an older school, and we're just starting to look at like this data and how does it behave. So I told you about this level of 1,000 ppm for CO2. Here you got your daily peak in CO2. This is the old school, and you see basically any month a year, any day a year, you're above that 1,000 threshold, no matter the outdoor weather or the indoor weather. And actually the same holds for this newer school. It's more threshold in kind of the shoulder months, May, June, it's at about 1,000, but in winter, especially when the windows are closed, they're typically above 1,000. So old or new, the initial view of the data doesn't look great. Then in this new school, we were looking at the data and we saw these spikes. So as it turned out, when the ventilation system works, these are just 5 classrooms. The average ppm is at about 1,000. The ventilation system turned out that it broke down. So we got to about 2,000 when it works for 50%. And then look at this here, we're at 4, we're at 3. And what happened was so interesting, and again, these are just initial explorations of the data. Then we started to look at, okay, does this impact the amount of time that the kids spend in the classroom, just as a first proxy for kind of productivity and exposure to learning. So when the ventilation system was working, here's your average time being spent in the class, and this is what happened when the ventilation system stopped working. The teacher basically said, let's just go play outside. You can't really go home because your parents are not there. And anecdotally, that was backed up by the teachers. So these are just some simple facts. And then here's the other school where they fixed the system. So I'm out of time. I hope, and I know this is not your conventional paper presentation, but I hope I've somewhat convinced you that health is the new carbon. Carbon is an unpriced externality. I've done a lot of work on that, but I'm now excited. I'm very pessimistic actually about health. I currently spend 17% of US GDP on healthcare with subpar outcomes, obviously. And what we know is that buildings strongly affect our health. It's where we spend 90% of our times. It depends on how it determines how we walk, etc. But it also determines what we breathe and the exposure to CO2. I think we're starting to learn some first lessons on indoor air quality, environmental quality, and cognitive performance. And I think there's a lot more to learn.
So I actually thought it was easier to read 3 papers and talk about 3 papers than it was to do 1. We all do these technical papers where it would be easy to talk, and Bill raised some issues about, identification. It's just really, really hard to do health studies well. If you guys read the New York Times on Sundays, there's Jane Brody, and my sister-in-law's an epidemiologist, and we spend a lot of time mocking her. Because for every week she's got some study about, well, this week they should do all proteins, and this week they should not exercise, and this week the squishy shoes are damaging. So every we're constantly trying to pursue health. So this is a good agenda for us. And I'll start with the get-goes. And I think he's right. I think it's an important thing to cover. And I think for those of you who teach, I teach in many of the classrooms around here, and I will have a class where I have 15 students in one, and then later in that day I'll have 30 students in the same room, and I can't teach 3 hours with 30 students in a small room because the CO2, I'm not sure CO2 or whatever it is, but same course material, same quality students, same everything, and they just can't do it. And so I think there's absolutely something to it, this stuff. So I think it's a big deal. Okay, so in terms of the 3 papers here, there's kind of an agenda here. There's not just 3 papers. We have moving to productivity, the benefit of healthy buildings, and this is the longitudinal study where they split things, and that's kind of a fun study to think about. There's certainly an awful lot of work these days being done about creative office space and what to do and how to create workers who are more productive. So this is kind of one of a bunch of papers we're working on things like this. We add, and I can't pronounce his name, Erdal Aydin. Yep. We had him to do the German study, and we talked about the renovations there. We spent most of the time talking about that paper. And the paper we just squeezed in at the end here is with, and I'm not going to try this one. Okay, so we have these 4 people. So, and here's the paper. So I actually thought the right thing for me using my time was to actually kind of justify the agenda as opposed to any one of the papers. So I think that everyone here can talk about differences at length and talk about identification strategies. I think it's fine. But I thought the agenda here is important here. So if you poke around, to Neil's point is that there's an awful lot of stuff that's happening right now on how to make people more productive, right? So in the office world, we've had office as an asset class forever, and now everything and its brother is creative office, right? Because we want to create more open space, create productivity, create collaboration amongst people. So we're going to create an environment that's productive, and so. We have an overwhelming majority of workers would like to be in a. This was from Forbes, but 87% of workers would like to have their current employer offer healthier workspace benefits. So clearly the employers in these office buildings want more health. That's on the demand side here. From retail, I get this nice quote from a firm that's consulting here. It says that basically all these sort of outputs for retail are going to be spending more time thinking about offering more wellness as part of the integral part of their business. So that's going to help there. And on multifamily, there's just a ton of stuff here being offered on these things now, but if you want to live in a healthier, happier life, find a friendly apartment building. So, there are firms now who are building buildings with their angle being to bring more people in and raise more rents is to actually ask, you have space there, you have a good location there, but you have a healthy building to be in. So that's, it's part of the building. I like this one. I saw there's a great picture. I'm sure you've seen it about the airflow in these buildings that are being studied now. About how most apartment buildings, older apartment buildings, have the air come in through the garage, and then they get sucked basically up through the building. And so that by the time, it's just really, it's from mechanical, like you guys spent time in a parking structure, right? That's the air that goes into the building. So people are studying these things, and now Niles is on this stuff. Okay, so the Gensler people, and I'm sure you've been in touch with them, right? So they've been doing this for a long time. And so there's been a bunch of architecture firms who've been trying to study the impact of these things and more productive stuff. And for the most part, have you guys seen the Gensler book? They do this research book every couple of years where they publish it, and it's really colorful, and it's got many of the same sort of features that Niles had, and it's high quality publication, and almost all deficient a little bit on the rigor side. So they're trying very hard to sell architectural skills to office builders and investors to get them to sort of amp up. And this is one of their white papers they have in their papers about can workplace and building design help filter polluted air. So there's a whole bunch of papers like this, and they're actively working on this stuff. And so I think Niles is actually, at some level, the economics profession is trying to catch up to where architects are trying to, and they're trying to bring some rigor to it. The fun part about reading those papers is he has done an awful lot of work to try to get his head around all these studies, right? So there's the lit review is way outside of my normal to read all these different papers about all these different kinds of things that clever epidemiologists are trying to measure impacts. And so there's a lot of clever people doing clever things there, and he's kind of bringing it back to urban and housing stuff or residential stuff. The problem, of course, with this stuff is that the science is a moving target also. And so I actually didn't start with this one. Well, I was going to start with things that health trends are one of these things that, every decade there's a trend that's kind of interesting. The one I was going to try to picture of was the spring shoes. Do you guys remember those? There was a while there where springy shoes were going to be the thing that were going to get all of us healthy. We were going to wear springy shoes, and they were going to make our gait like this, and we were going to burn calories, and that was going to be a healthy trend. And there was science behind this. But I was just poking around. I found this one. A medical specialist is making regular bi-monthly examinations of a group of people. This is our sample study, right? Of all walks of life, there's our heterogeneity. 45% of the group had smoked for Chesterfield for more than 10 years. And after 10 months, the medical specialist reports that he observed no adverse effect on the nose, throat, and sinuses of the group of the smoking Chesterfields. And then we got Ronald Reagan. This is Ronald Reagan selling Chesterfield. So, and my point in this one is, it was kind of a fun slide here, but is that it's really important, I think, to get our science right. It's taken forever to get people to stop smoking, right? I mean, for years we had scientists saying it was okay to do that, and every decade since then there's been something. So we have all kinds of trends right now on the diet. So we have the keto diet, the low carb diets, we have all these kind of diets right now. So people are making enormous investments in their health and welfare. They spend a lot of money at Whole Foods because they think they're getting healthy, but there's really very little science that kind of supports this long-term trend, and we're trying to do that here. Okay, but Niles had this great quote somewhere in paper number 2. It says, empirically assessing the consequences of deficient housing conditions on human is challenging, right? So well put, right? So, and we all know how hard it is to do empirical work in urban areas as it is, and we add humans to the mix. So this is my very brief critique of the papers is renovation really exogenous? And, he threw up the defense of saying that it's institutional, but, crappy buildings get worse outcomes, my guess. The supervisor in that building says he gets to schedule things, and he gets to allocate which one gets better ones and which ones later. So I don't think this is purely exogenous. It's the best you can do probably. The sample size is 6.5 years, but there's an awful lot of people who are very short, and if you're doing a before and after, with over half the population being a couple of years, it's a really funny sample to look at, right? So you get very funny results there. I thought you could run a regression with just longer stayers, maybe how that works. Are there spillovers? I think for me, this was one thing I just think that these things are clustered spatially. It's much, according to your question earlier about space and Ruchi's paper, these things are clustered, right? So people complain about these things in a meaningful way. So in terms of the new buildings, this is all perceived environmental conditions, right? So we all hate survey data at some level because at the end people feel sick, but I don't know, this is a big placebo, right? We put a bunch of people in a new shiny building and told them they're gonna be healthier. They probably said, I feel better. And so we don't know, right? So there's just a bunch of things in here, and and generally differences require lots and lots of sort of tests about pre-trending and post-trending and believing things that the parallel shift is constant over time. So it's really hard to know if this is true or not. I really liked the sensors in the last one, and I'm really curious where you go with that one, but it's just not gone very far just yet. Okay, so just to sum things up, so despite these sort of tough empirical issues, I think I believe that humans perform better where conditions are conducive, right? check, right? No doubt about that. But did we really measure performing better? Did we measure these conditions, and did we measure conducive? And I don't know if we have just yet. But I think here my question is what's the agenda? So I think this is, kind of throwing it up for the classroom, the group as a whole, is, what are we going to do with this? Because NILS, I think, is addressing something that's hard empirically but important for us, right? And so what do you do? I think for me, I was thinking about papers like this, is like Ruchi's thing earlier. I liked you're asking a hard question about competition versus knowledge, right, and sophistication. These are important questions, and I don't know if you're ever going to get the data set that proves any of this right. The thing I was wondering is, what's your agenda going to look like to actually knowing that the data set's always going to really kind of be imperfect, right? What's your goal? Your goal is to convince us that health matters? Because I don't think we need to do that, right? So we check that box. Is it to calibrate a specific, key CO2 level to a specific policy? Maybe asking quite a bit, because the parameters are small relative to the noise, relative to other factors at work, and other policies at work. It's going to be hard to know that one. So I'm trying to figure, I think, what's the point? What's the agenda that sort of says, I'm going to spend I appreciate you doing this, and I liked reading it, but I'm trying to figure out where the lever is next. What am I going to do next? So I'll stick around for a couple minutes and listen to your response, but I'd like reading the paper quite a bit. On to something important, human capital matters, and now all of us are in these buildings that might be sick, and so it matters. Do we know how to get the most out of humans? All right, I'll leave it at that.